This must be a divine appointment. This is a conversation that God had planned from the beginning of time. I needed to listen. We never know when it's going to happen. We might be waiting for it to happen, and we might not be ready for it to happen. But God has divine appointments for us, times when God desires us to be witnesses. Bearing witness as followers of Jesus Christ is not about taking and protecting the gospel. It's about helping other people to connect with the gospel and seeing how it interacts in their lives, that they might know the grace and the new life and the forgiveness that are ours through Jesus Christ.
Have you ever been asked to do something and thought to yourself, I really don't have time to fit that into my schedule? Have you ever had someone who's really important to you ask you to do something, and you've kind of snapped back at them and say, but why me? Why now? Can't you find somebody else to do that? Have you ever wished that maybe you could just let people know that you've got important things to do and you'll have plenty of time to get involved in that later? My name is Esther, and I'm here to tell you my story. It's about God's call and God's time. I am a Jew. I grew up not in Israel, I grew up in Persia. An adopted daughter of my older cousin Mordecai, for my parents had both died. Our great-great-great-grandfather Kish had been captured and brought here with many other Jews from Israel years ago. The exile is now over, and many have gone back to Israel. But we, along with a number of other folks, decided this is really our home now. We might as well stay here. I don't really remember exactly what I was doing the day this all happened. It's really been a whirlwind. One day I was doing my chores at home, and the next day I'm in a contest to be the queen. Apparently, King Xerxes was not very pleased with his queen, for he had asked her to come into his court while he and all his friends were drinking. She refused. I guess I can understand that, but it's really not acceptable to refuse the king. All the other men that were gathered there said, this won't do. If all the women in the land find out that Queen Vashti refused to come into the court of the king, well, that could catch on. They might all start standing up to their husbands, and then where will we be? Indeed. Where would we be? So then his advisors gave him counsel. You should have Queen Vashti dethroned. Never let her come into your presence again. And then we will search throughout the land among all the young women and find you a new queen. The king decided that was a good idea. So there I was, quietly living my life with Mordecai and the rest of our extended family, when a servant of the king came and took me off to the palace. I met with the man who was in charge of the king's harem, and he kind of took a liking to me, and he actually gave me 7 maids to wait on me. All new clothes, good food to eat, cosmetic treatments, a whole year of being pampered day and night. I didn't have to lift a finger. Now, don't get me wrong, that wasn't so hard to take. But I found myself at some point getting a little bored and wondering, is this what my time is going to consist of now? Spending all of this money just for all of us to be presented to the king, and we'll see which one he chooses. I was really shocked when it was my turn to go to the king, and he chose me. Out of all the other women of the land, he chose me. Cousin Mordecai was so proud of me, but he did warn me. He said, don't let anyone know that you're a Jew. Kind of thought that was odd. Why would I hide who I am? But apparently some people look down on others because they're different. I did as he told me, for I could trust Mordecai. I knew he loved me as a daughter. In fact, each day he would come by the courtyard just to check on me. One day, cousin Mordecai was out by the city gates when he heard a rumor that 2 men were planning to assassinate the king. So he came to my courtyard and he told me this news, and I got the news to the king. Just in time, the men were caught, and Mordecai's name was written in the king's book, that this was a hero who had saved the life of the king. Sometime later, one of the king's most highest placed officials, Haman, came into power. And even, I'm not sure why the king did this, but even the king said the people in the streets should bow down to Haman when he went outside the palace gates. So he would go out and riding on one of the king's horses, and everybody in the streets would bow down to him. Except Mordecai. For Mordecai was a faithful, faithful Jew, and he would not bow to any man. Some of Haman's advisors noticed that this man standing off to the side by the gates was not bowing down, and they went to Haman and said, that guy, he doesn't bow down to you. That made Haman so angry. He inquired as to who this man was that would not pay him the respect he felt he deserved. He found out that Mordecai was a Jew. So Haman went to the king and said, King, there's a group of people that have stayed in our land that are causing trouble. I think we need to get rid of them. And he tricked the king into signing an edict that proclaimed free reign on killing the Jews. He wanted to annihilate all of us, all of the Jews. And Haman himself even ordered the construction of a gallows in the center of the city square so that he could start this tirade against the Jews by hanging Mordecai first. Well, Mordecai got word of this well before I did, and he was struck with dread and fear. So he did what is common for our people. He put on sackcloth and ashes as a symbol of mourning. When he didn't arrive in the courtyard the next day to visit me, I got concerned. I was worried where he was. So I sent one of my servants out to the city streets to find him, and he came back and said, I found your cousin Mordecai, but he's sitting in the city streets. He has sackcloth and ashes all over him, and he's wailing and he's crying. So I sent them back with clothing. I said, get him to put these on. But they came back and said he refused to put the clothes on. And he sends you this message, and here is a copy of the edict that has been signed by the king, ordering the murder of all of the Jews. And he asks that you would go to the king and plead on behalf of your people. That I would just go to the king. Is he crazy? It is worse to go to the king uninvited and unbeckoned than it is to not go to the king when you've been summoned. Queen Vashti only got dethroned. I could be killed on the spot. I would not presume to go into the king's throne room uninvited. I learned that in my year of training. Mordecai must know this. He's asking me to do something I cannot do. This is not the right time. So I sent word back to Mordecai. I said, you know that the only way my life will be spared is if he holds out his scepter to me to invite me into his presence, and there's no guarantee he will do that. Isn't there someone else that can intervene on behalf of our people? This is not the time for me to get involved. Mordecai's response back to me was not as I'd hoped. In fact, Mordecai was teaching me from his posture of mourning in the city streets. He said, don't you think for a minute that because you live in the palace of the king, that this edict will not be acted out upon you, should your heritage be made known. In fact, Mordecai was sure that the Jews' lives would be spared somehow. He didn't know how, but he knew God would be faithful to save them. But he said, you, however, may not if you refuse to do what you could do in this situation. And then he said something that has been in the depth of my heart ever since. He said, "Who knows? But perhaps you have been placed in a royal position for such a time as this." For such a time as this. Indeed, who knows? I couldn't refuse him, but I would not go without the prayers and the support of my people. So I sent word back to Mordecai again. I said, "Gather all of the Jews of the city and call them to fasting and to prayer. And I too will fast and pray, as will all my servants. And then after the third day, I will go to the king, and if I perish, I perish." So I fasted and I prayed, and others fasted and prayed for me. The third day came and went, and on the morning of the fourth day I rose. I put on one of my finest robes, and I made my way to the throne room of the king. I entered the room, and I stood in just the right spot where I knew the king could see me from his throne. There were other people mingling around, and I heard them whispering, "What is she doing? The king didn't call for the queen. Doesn't she know this could mean her certain death?" Indeed, I knew, but I felt strong. I knew I was being buoyed by the prayers of our people. I stood tall, and I wasn't once thinking, "Why me? Why now?" I was thinking, for such a time as this. For such a time as this. The king looked up. He saw me standing there. He smiled. And he took his golden scepter in his hand and he raised it toward me. The sign that he was inviting me into his presence. My heart leapt into my throat. I could hear my servants starting to breathe again behind me. And my mind raced as I walked toward the king. As I got close to him, he said, "What is your petition?" I said, "If it please the king, I would like to invite you and Haman to join me for a feast at my banquet tonight." The king said, "I'd be very pleased to do this." And I knew that Haman would be. He would think this was a real perk to get to come to a feast just with the king and queen all by himself. So that night at banquet, I was sitting there and serving both the king and Haman. And the king asked again, "What is your petition, Esther?" And I said, "Bear with me if you would, my king. I will tell you tomorrow if you would come once again with Haman to another banquet tomorrow night." He said, "Certainly." As we finished that banquet and he went back into his sleeping quarters, I began to prepare myself for the next day. What I didn't prepare myself for was what God would do that evening. For the king was not able to sleep, and I'm sure it was not my cooking, but the king was not able to sleep. So he called one of his scribes to come in and read to him from his book of the events of his kingdom. And as the scribe was reading, they got to the part where it said the man Mordecai, sitting by the city gates, heard the rumor that someone was to assassinate the king, and he saved the king's life. And the king stopped the scribe from reading, and he said, "Wait, does it record that I did anything to honor this man?" And the scribe looked, and he says, "No, king, it does not say anything." "Well, then I must honor this man. I've forgotten to do it." So he calls in Haman, and he says to Haman, "What would be a good thing for me to do to honor a man who is very special to me?" Haman, thinking it was him the king wanted to honor, started to come up with all these really great ideas. And the king said, "Good. I want you to do that for the man named Mordecai who sits at the city gates." I wish I could have seen Haman's face. And I heard that the next day he had to put Mordecai up onto one of the king's most stately horses and lead him through the city streets, shouting out, "Behold, this is what is done to show favor to someone that the king honors." And he had to say it over and over again. It must have killed him. But I'm sure the way he got through it was noticing that off in the city square, the gallows were being finished on which he would hang Mordecai as soon as he could. That evening we came to the second banquet, and the king said, "And now, Esther, will you tell me what is your petition?" I said, "O king, it has come to my attention that someone has devised a plan to take my life and the life of all of my people." The king was incredulous. He said, "Who on earth would do such a thing?" And I looked across the table at a very shocked and stunned Haman, his eyes darting back and forth between the king and me. And I looked at him and I pointed my finger and I said, "That man, that enemy of the king." No matter how much Haman tried to beg the king's forgiveness, it was no use. For the king had not realized, when Haman came to him and made him sign that edict, that the man whom Haman hated so much was the very man that had saved the king's life. And so Haman met his death on the very gallows he had constructed for Mordecai. Not only was my life saved, but the lives of so many of my people. And Mordecai was raised into a high position of service in the court of the king. What had started out as an almost impossible situation became something more than we ever imagined. If I had not taken the time to do what I could do, we would not have received such blessings. If I had not stopped asking, "How am I ever going to find time to do this?" and had not looked around at the situation and the people that were involved, I never would have realized how God had placed me in that position for that very special moment. If I had not stopped being so focused on my own needs and wants and whining, "Why me? Why now?" and not opened my eyes to the needs of the people right there in front of me, I might have missed the opportunity to be part of God's plan. And if I had not stopped assuming that I'd have plenty of time later to get involved, and not accepted that the time to respond was now, the time to get involved was right now, I would not have known how much I was needed by my community. When you are in a new situation, when you have struggles that are coming your way in your community, when someone asks you to serve, I encourage you to stop and just to ask, who knows? What if God is calling you to do something today or this week or in this difficult season in the life of your faith community? Who knows? But that you are here. You are here for such a time as this. Amen.
We can find an excerpt of Esther's testimony in the book of Esther, chapter 4, verses 1 through 17, and I'll read that over us right now. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and to plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All of the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions.